I'm very honored to introduce the discussion tonight about cities. I'm particularly honored and somewhat nervous to speak before our three mayors. I congratulate you to get three mayors into one room. It's very impressive. I will try to focus my introduction on what I believe we could talk about tonight. My opinions are those of an architect who has had the opportunity to work in many European cities. Through this work, I have been in a position to witness the challenges that confront our cities and how they are being considered in different ways. I will try to set out what I think are the big challenges for all European cities, as I believe that this is a more specific focus tonight. It is, however, completely appropriate that we talk about the issues facing us, not only as planners and architects concerned with the design of cities, but with politicians who must consider the role of the city in relationship to the two great issues of our time: the climate crisis and all the issues of sustainability and energy that goes with it, and the growing problem of social and financial inequality. Walking around Zurich, we easily remind ourselves of the qualities that attracts us to cities and why we find the idea of city so fascinating. Here in Zurich, we can witness all the best things about cities. Beyond its privileged location, the city is a living testimony to our desire to represent our ideas of settlement and community, our need to make collective gestures from individual effort. The city is a collection of individual buildings that somehow accept devices and structures, both physical and visual, sentimental and technical. We find in the city this mediation between the individual and society, and within this we find the attempt to establish buildings and spaces that represent this collective desire, the idea of society, of community, and one might even say civilization. We find history and continuity evidenced by the side-by-side existence of buildings of different epochs, regimes, and styles. We enjoy the city as a testament to the literal accumulation of attempts to negotiate between the practical and the ideal. This is an idea of the city which we all relate to. To some degree, we all share in these rather sentimental ideas of what a city should be, of how we might want to live, of how we might achieve a quality of life that gives us individual comfort within the embrace of a community. Not every city conforms to this romantic picture, a city of pleasant spaces, good architecture of different periods, both vernacular and formal, domestic and monumental. In fact, this description of a city doesn't make so much sense in many parts of the world. We cannot talk about cities in general, as the issues that confront Lagos, Sao Paulo, Shanghai are extremely different to these ones. Moreover, some of these challenges are extreme. We are, for instance, approaching a situation where 50% of the world's urban population are living in so-called temporary and provisional conditions, from emergency refugee settlements in the Middle East to slums in the Indian subcontinent to shanty towns and favelas in Central and South America. Within that context, the consideration of the European city might seem rather insignificant, but I think the impulses of urbanity, that is to aspire to creating a comfortable environment that balances individual comfort with the idea of community, are universal. In my own professional lifetime, I have seen the conversation about the city migrate from one concern to another. When I was a student, and even as a young architect, the great anxiety, the Eurocentric one, was the form of the city. After the negative consequences of post-war planning, a re-evaluation of the physical nature of the city was taking place. There was, quite rightly, a concern that cities had lost their shape and had been distorted by over-enthusiastic traffic planners ideological architects, and stubborn planners. The discussion centered around the idea of regaining the traditional urban qualities of the 18th and 19th century that had been eroded by new ideas of planning. The gradual loss of confidence in modernism not only affected architecture, but our attitude to planning as well. Communities unhappy with large and failing housing estates, drastic traffic planning and unsatisfactory urban conditions saw large-scale planning visions as dangerous and suspicious. In Britain, this coincided with a growing skepticism about the public sector, regarding it as inefficient and out of touch. Protected bureaucracy was replaced by a new orthodoxy, a belief that the private sector was more effective and naturally efficient. Of course, it also meant that the public purse could benefit from the ideology of free enterprise by giving the responsibility for driving development. Nothing can demonstrate this Anglo-Saxon approach better than the daily evolving London skyline, which can only be explained as the result of financial speculation, the leverage of land value, and private competition. We cannot believe that this operation has been carried out for the common good, and we must question to what degree citizens have benefited from this transformation of their own city. If the post-war period suffered from the overly ambitious visions of planners and architects, the recent development of London demonstrates the collapse of common interest and criteria and the loss of what we might call urbanity. I'm sensitive to the fact that this is an especially Anglo-Saxon problem, and that a society like Switzerland has managed to maintain a much more articulate and considered planning process, as well as a more state-protected public environment, together with public infrastructure and services. Meanwhile, in London, as the pendulum swings once again, even there is a growing realization that planning needs to be proactive, not reactive, if we are to find any balance between the motivation and tendencies of the free market and the otherwise unrepresented concerns of the wider society. Let me cross the channel and consider other examples of this struggle, because all cities now face this task of somehow controlling the immense forces of capital investment and real estate development, while encouraging the growth of the city as a collective place to live, work, and enjoy our lives in a fair and constructive manner. This struggle may take different shapes in different cities, but the issues have a global dimension. Since all these cities have their own history and cultural conditions, each reacts to the common problems differently and with different emphasis. While London stands for a very libertarian attitude towards planning and cultivates one of the least protective planning systems, it is interesting to see how other European cities have developed their own balance between proactive planning control and laissez-faire. What is clear is that everyone is struggling with the same issues, and that planning legislation of some time is critical. It is also clear that planning control is not the sole responsibility of planners, but it must be supported or be represented by political commitment to what type of city we want to live in, which is dependent on politics as well as planning strategies. I've characterized the London situation as one of laissez-faire planning and the influence of rampant investment, of a rampant investment environment. But of course, these are symptoms as much as causes. The main driver behind this is increasing land value and everything that comes with it. And in urban terms, everything does come with it. Unless we take disruptive measures, the market follows a ruthless path. In this discussion, this comparison, it's interesting to witness the struggle that Berlin has at the moment. And I hope that Mr. Muller will talk about this later. Berlin inevitably takes up causes and principles that other cities tend to ignore. Berlin, as you know, is unique in its relationship to its own history and as a consequence to its identity. It maintains a sense of stubborn idealism, presuming that the city belongs to everyone, not just to the mayor and to planners. Berlin's economy is not based on anything particular, and that's why it's always seen to be as a poor city. On the other hand, it has become desirable, especially by a younger generation. The reason for this desirability, for this attraction, is its quality of life, the openness that was given by low rents and available space. As this quality is slowly identified and transferred into investment opportunities, the very identity of the city is challenged by the change of land value. While in Zurich and other cities, raising land values are uncomfortable and have negative consequences, in Berlin, the problem is regarded as existential, as it challenges everything that the city identifies with. Low rents have allowed everyone a chance not only for a comfortable place to live, but also the opportunity to run small businesses, and the tendency towards gentrification is identified as one of the city's biggest challenges. There are attempts to limit investment in certain areas and proposals to freeze rents for the next 5 years, something nearly inconceivable in London, despite the fact that in London, normal people can no longer afford to live anywhere near the centre of the city. As well as this, Berlin is engaged in a program of increasing housing provision under the principle of not just building housing, but rather the increase of affordable housing. So this is the first issue I would like to raise and refer to, the enormous issue of rising land values, and in particular the effect on housing. Strategies need to be adopted to ensure that housing is a positive component of urbanism and not just an obligation that we have to provide. The second issue about cities I'd like to raise is regarding tourism and the effect on what is now being referred as over-tourism. While this phenomenon has affected certain cities more than others, Venice being the obvious example, it is increasingly a concern in other cities. Rome, Amsterdam, Florence, Berlin, and Lisbon have all witnessed protests by citizens against the effects of tourism. The Spanish press have dubbed this rising anger tourismophobia. Possibly the saddest case is that of Barcelona. A city greatly admired for its urbanity and quality of life is now overrun by tourism. Last year, the city received 32 million visitors, 20 times its population. The sheer volume is driving up rents, pushing residents out of neighborhoods, overwhelming public space, and destroying the unique sense of place that characterized the city, with souvenir shops, rowdy bars, and tour buses. This phenomenon, when it is coupled with the pressures of speculation and investment, create to combine an urban vacuum in the very center of our cities, a vacuum filled with the excess of consumption and leveraging and banishing the very qualities that made it attractive in the first place. It is fascinating to see the city of Barcelona try to reverse its policy and now respond aggressively in an attempt to regain the city for its own citizens. I now want to raise a third topic which relates to the idea of the city and overlaps with the other two issues. That is the attitude towards protection in the face of development. We are reasonably comfortable and sophisticated about protecting monuments and buildings of historic or cultural importance, the obvious ones. What is more difficult is to objectively consider the role of less significant buildings, but the ones that contribute quietly to the character and identity of the city. This isn't just nostalgia, but it relates to the identity of place and how we relate to our own city and our history. This isn't a plea against development, but only that protection and development are seen as mutual considerations in the growth of our cities and not always in conflict as they seem to be. We also must develop, anyway, a more considerate way of reusing buildings. Once again, we must question the dominant and normally irresistible desire to develop because of investment criteria and the exploitation of land value over building worth. There's rightly a growing pressure to consider more seriously the reuse of buildings, and this is another situation where the bigger issues of sustainability stimulate us to make more sensible decisions and more meaningful ones as well. By the way of conclusion, I want to encourage our three mayors to discuss these things that I feel critical to the quality of our cities and the pursuit of urbanity, not just urbanization. How do we control the effects of land values? How do we address the importance of housing, especially in consideration of growing financial and social inequalities? How do we protect the texture and diversity of the city as expressed through its complex architectural history? Lastly, how can we protect our cities becoming hollowed out by tourism that doesn't seem to contribute at all to the urbanity we might achieve in our cities? Finally, I would like to encourage the three mayors that the problems of our cities are no longer in the hands of architects and planners, if they ever were, but firmly in the hands of politicians. It is you who must insist on the conditions that cities must guarantee: clean air, good and sustainable transportation, the repositioning of traffic priorities behind that of the pedestrian, good affordable housing throughout the city, reducing the need for using up more green space for building, and above all, the maintenance of urbanity as part of the guarantee for our quality of life. Thank you.